Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf here of Daily Clout, and I am so honored and thrilled to have with us today Jay Cameron, the Litigation Director of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Welcome, Mr. Cameron.
Naomi, thank you so much for having me.
We're thrilled. And a quick bio, Mr. Cameron, as I mentioned, is Litigation Director at the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms in Canada. It's a nonprofit law firm dedicated to the education and defense of Canadians' constitutional rights, especially freedom of religion and conscience, freedom of speech, and freedom of association. He's very distinguished, worked in a national law firm in Calgary, Alberta, worked as a Crown prosecutor, and appeared at every level of court in Alberta, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, all over Canada. He believes in the importance of constitutionalism and the rule of law to national success. He believes that everyone is created equal by God and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So I'm just thrilled to have you. And just for those who do not know, one reason Mr. Cameron is such a leading figure for us and such an important voice is that he and his firm are taking action against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's tyrannical moves against the Charter of Rights in Canada. Please tell us about that, Mr. Cameron.
Right. So emergency legislation is just what it says. It's meant for the utmost extremities and when all other laws have failed. And so the Emergencies Act in Canada had never previously been invoked. Previously, it was called the War Measures Act. It was utilized for two events in Canadian history. One was the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, where people were rounded up and put in concentration camps because they were Japanese. And that was a terrible stain on the national image, and the government was later forced to apologize. The Japanese Canadians, of course, never got their property back. The other time that the War Measures Act was invoked was in 1970, and it was invoked to deal with a situation involving political kidnapping and murder in Quebec, and the army was sent in. And so the current version of the Emergencies Act in Canada, which is the invocation of which has made its rounds around the world, everybody has talked about it and heard about it, was brought in the 80s, and it had never been invoked before, like I said. And it says that a national emergency is an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that either seriously endangers the lives, health, and safety of Canadians, and it's so big as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, or it seriously threatens the ability of the government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. And so those are big things. And so the question is, everybody's heard about the truckers in Ottawa. The question is, do a bunch of truckers driving across the country and sitting on the side of the road in winter, hoping for a political audience because they're suffering with respect to the government's vaccine mandates, and while they're sitting on the side of the road, they're playing ball hockey, and their kids are playing on bouncy houses, and they've brought portable hot tubs, and they're soaking themselves in the street because it's minus 15. Is that a national emergency? And of course, the government in Canada declared an emergency and said that it is, but in no reality that anybody with a brain recognizes is that a national emergency. These are people who have come across the country in the middle of winter, and the reason they did so is because they're suffering. They've lost their civil liberties, they've lost their jobs, they have lost their ability to freely enter and leave the country because you have to be vaccinated to do that in Canada. And so they went to Ottawa in the middle of winter, taking the extreme step of driving thousands of miles. And the government bought up all the hotels in the area. Wow. So that people were forced to be on the street in the middle of winter. You have no place to survive the Canadian winter except in your trucks. And then when you're hoping for a political audience with the governing elite, the elite say that you're just a bunch of racists and misogynists, and you're dismissed and told to go home because you've made your point. And so that was the situation in Canada recently.
Yes. Wow. So of course, those of us watching, well, let me take one step back. What does your action specifically do? Are you calling for, does it call for Justin Trudeau to I mean, he's rescinded the Emergencies Act, as I understand it, right? So is there some penalty that you're pursuing, that he needs to come up with, civil or criminal? I can't quite tell, because he wrongly declared an emergency without the conditions rising to the level of an emergency. What exactly does your organization's action do, and what is the outcome if you're successful?
Right. So yes, as you said, the emergency has been declared to be over. It was declared to be over probably because the financial system became destabilized, because people were concerned that their assets were going to be frozen and they couldn't get at their property, as well as the fact that the debate in the Senate was going against the government. And so the emergency, so-called, was hastily ended. But the action was started, at least by the Justice Center, on behalf of some retired military personnel, as well as some retired police. And they had their assets frozen either because they peacefully protested or because they donated to what was a peaceful protest. And they couldn't pay their bills, they couldn't pay their mortgage. And of course, in the Western world, we believe in property rights. When you work for something, you have a right to it. The government can't just come in and seize it without due process of law, without a court order. And so, they were frightened, they were freaked out. They were worried about a knock on the door, and it's a seizure. And there's constitutional protections against the seizure of people's property. And so when you have your bank account frozen, that raises very serious constitutional questions. And so what the lawsuit is looking for is simply a recognition by the courts that this violated the rights of these applicants, and see that it was not justified, that it was against the law and the Constitution. And just a recognition of that by the courts would go a long ways to putting the applicants in this case, put their minds at ease. And of course, there should be costs associated with that. But really, in Canada right now, the situation is so grim that really a declaration by a court that this was unjustified would go a long ways in the right direction.
So I understand, and thank you so much for representing those citizens. And you're 1,000% correct that the freezing of assets, quite apart from the suppression of other civil liberties, which we've seen in democracies around the world, is kind of a whole new, monster in this arsenal of tyrannies, and it would have massive, far-reaching implications. I imagine that financial interests are supportive of your action, right? I mean, it just destabilizes all property holders, all investment portfolios, all hedge fund managers to have these arbitrary powers of the government to freeze people's assets. Are you getting support from the equivalent of Wall Street in Canada?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, just like everything that we've seen over the course of the last 2 years, people tend to go into their foxholes and say, as long as they're not coming after me, then I don't have anything to worry about because I'm not in this group, or I'm not in that group. I'm not a churchgoer, or I haven't been recently out of the country. And so people say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me, so why should I worry? And there's a significant amount of that still in Canada, because people are saying, well, I wasn't protesting, or I haven't peacefully protested, or I haven't donated, and so why should I care? And so the government tells the banks, you have to freeze these accounts. And what the banks should do is say, hold on a second, we believe in property rights. You can't just tell us to do this. We're going to file a court application. But instead, what the banks did is they went ahead and froze those accounts. And so this is the age-old problem with respect to tyranny. It just continues and continues unless somebody stands up and says, this is enough, this is wrong.
So I was shocked that my own bank, TD Bank, which I've now withdrawn all my money from, was one of the banks I gathered to have frozen assets. Why didn't the banks resist? I would have thought that would, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or even an economist to know that the next move is that people like me would race to TD Bank and withdraw our funds because they're not, honorable or lawful custodians of our assets. Why wouldn't they have lawyers? Why wouldn't the lawyers say, no, we're going to hash this out in the courts. We're not going to go along with that.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple of things you touched on there that are really important. Number one, people have to remember that banks don't naturally get your money just because that's the way the system works. You have to give your money to banks, and the banks are supposed to hold that money in trust, pay interest, right? And there's a relationship there. And if they start seizing your money, then that's a violation of the most basic trust principle, because they're taking what's yours and saying, we're not going to give it to you anymore. And so, the banks ought to have clued in. And yes, the banks have lawyers, but unfortunately, like a lot of what's going on politically, and I don't want to stray into the realm of conspiracy theory here, but you've written yourself about the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum, and a lot of these banks are members of the World Economic Forum.
Oh, wow.
And I'm not going to go further down that road, but the fact is that there is a growing consortium of businesses and political figures who are moving in lockstep in one particular direction. And the right of peaceful protest and dissent is not in that direction.
That is really scary. And I guess I just want to say for the record that, when large entities align, which we've seen many times before in history, it's not a conspiracy theory, right? If it's really happening. And there's a precedent historically. I mean, Mussolini's definition of fascism was that he aligned corporations and a fascistic government. And the same thing happened in Germany with corporations that, are extant to this very day. So like, ThyssenKrupp and IBM even. I mean, this is just historical precedent. So I personally think we have to be like willing to, have these conversations. But all right, so let's now go back to your clients. So this is a civil action. It's not a criminal action. If you're successful, I understand the symbolic value of a court saying you can't do this to Justin Trudeau. Is there any personal accountability that a ruling against Justin Trudeau would have, or his cabinet? Part of why I ask this is that we hosted a webinar for people about how to sue their governor, their school board, their board of health, not just in their official capacity, but personally. Will Justin Trudeau suffer any consequences, fines, any accountability personally if you're successful?
Naomi, my answer to that is that anytime any tyrant or authoritarian figure is told you can't do something, that's akin to a punishment all by itself. But as far as costs and damages, that's all in the purview of the courts. And while I hope that the courts will say, this is that you ought to get your hand slapped for this and it ought to sting, that remains to be seen.
I understand. All right, so I looked at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canadians, and from everything I read, everything the truckers were doing was protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I noticed that Justin Trudeau's cabinet kept calling it an unlawful protest or an illegal protest, and I was interviewed by the Global News, a Canadian news outlet, that kept saying they're an unlawful protest. In your view, were the truckers were their actions not protected actions under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of petition?
Yeah, I absolutely think that there's a lot of what was going on in Ottawa was protected. And there were many different people there. There's many different independent parties. And so was every single thing that every single person was doing, was that constitutionally protected? I doubt it. But the bulk of what was going on in Ottawa was protected. And there is a reason why there is a right to assemble, as it says in the Bill of Rights in the US, to seek a redress for grievances. And that's because that action is when you gather like that to protest and to raise the voice of dissent, that's democracy in action. You're telling the ruling party, the ruling elites, that this is hurting us and we need you to stop doing what you're doing. And that's all the more important, Naomi, in Canada, because democracy has basically been on life support in Canada for the last 2 years. Parliament has largely been shut down. The legislatures are largely shut down, and the people who are making the rules are not the people's elected representatives. They're health ministers and bureaucrats, health bureaucrats, as well as ministers, federal ministers, and they're bypassing the legislature and parliament, which is comprised of the people's democratically elected representatives. And so when you are a person who is suffering because of these vaccine mandates or because of the closures of businesses or churches or whatever, what normally you do is you send an email to your MP or your MLA, to your elected representative. But those people, what they've been saying to the people who complain is, we're not doing this. It's the health doctors who are doing this, or it's the bureaucrats who are doing this. And that's what Canadians have been told for the last 2 years. And so the act of protest is really an act of desperation. It is the last available option for democracy.
Right.
If you want democracy, you have to be able to take your message to the politicians, because the politicians themselves are not the ones debating and making these rules.
Understood. So what you're telling me, it's so important. It echoes what happened in Australia and what's happening in the United States, that health ministers, boards of health, government health agencies have been empowered to bypass Congress, or in your case, your parliament. What is the solution for that? I mean, how do you get your parliament back under your system? And I mean, by the way, I'm hearing from hundreds and hundreds of Canadians who are asking me this question, and I don't know the answer. You do.
Well, there's a few things. First of all, the Constitution protects democracy, and the Supreme Court of Canada, like other courts around the world, have said that, especially in the United States, that the government derives its authority and legitimacy from the consent of the governed. And the people have to be able to see themselves in the laws which are being made, which is why you have an election in the first place.
Right.
So token democracy is no democracy at all. If you have an election and the people who are elected are not the ones making the laws for the populace, that's not democracy at all. It's just a veneer for fascism and a dictatorship. And that's what has happened in Canada. You have elections, but they are largely inconsequential with respect to the things that are happening with respect to COVID. And so the courts have to reestablish democratic action. But unfortunately, so far, the courts have said, well, governments are allowed to delegate, and they can delegate without checks and balances, like meaningful debate with respect to COVID regulations. That's perfectly legitimate. And so when those kinds of decisions come out, they undermine faith in democracy. They undermine faith in the institutions, because people realize that they're being cut out of the picture and that there's a ruling elite which has been established, and they're not required to listen to people.
Wow. So I'm still thinking about this landscape of bypassing Parliament. So it really doesn't matter ultimately what the debates are in Parliament, or really who's elected, if the power and the decision making is being redirected to these unelected boards of health or health ministers. And you're saying the courts are the solution to that? The courts can rule that the health ministers do not have the powers that have been given them. Is that correct? Is that your system?
Well, what I'm saying is that there's 3 branches of government, and to a significant extent in Canada, the executive branch and the legislative branch have been collapsed into each other, right? The same group of people who are making the laws are also the people who are carrying out the laws. And that's not the way that the system is supposed to work. Those 3 branches are meant to balance each other and prevent abuse of authority. And so really the last recourse is the courts, because that's the 3rd branch of government. And they have to say, look, in order for us to have meaningful democracy, in order for us to have meaningful constitutionalism, there has to be a check on executive authority.
Gotcha. I see. So it's the executive overreach that's over empowering the health ministers to override or bypass your parliament. Is that correct?
That's basically correct. And I think that over the course of many decades, laws have brought in which give more and more power to bureaucrats or to ministers, what are the equivalent of secretaries in the US.
Right.
And so because they have that power, they have this unilateral ability, and they've used it to trample on people's civil liberties.
So I imagine parliamentarians across the political spectrum in Canada are upset and feeling disempowered. This is not a partisan issue. Is that correct? The ones who are upset across the board?
I don't know that that's the case, because you have a group in Canada who have power. You have a minority government, and it's propped up by another minority party. and they have power, and so they're perfectly content with the situation, I think. But other parliamentarians are upset with it because they realize that it's impossible at the moment for them to take back democratic control, or it's very difficult, at least. I shouldn't say impossible.
Understood. Okay, let's go back to your clients. We were talking about whether the protests in Ottawa were covered by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It sounds as if your clients' actions were wholly covered by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? They donated peacefully, they protested peacefully. Is that correct? Is that why you represented them?
Yes, absolutely. And the people who donated across the country, 10, 20, 25, $50, and there's thousands of people who donated like that. Their intention, I'm sure, was to donate to a legal protest.
Right.
And many of the things that were happening in Ottawa, the vast majority of which are legal. And so when you donate $20 and you have your bank account frozen, that's a very serious problem. And so, yes, I would say that our clients, they donated in good faith without any intention that was criminal. And I expect that any issues that they're having will eventually be resolved. Right. That's the hope, at least.
Their accounts are still frozen?
Some of their accounts are still frozen. This challenge to the Emergencies Act, I believe that all of the applicants, their accounts have now been unfrozen after a matter of days. But certainly there are other clients that the Justice Center represents who were involved in the peaceful protest in Ottawa whose accounts are still frozen.
Oh my gosh, Mr. Cameron.
In jail.
Oh, wow. How many people would you estimate had their accounts frozen in Canada as a whole, roughly?
Hundreds of people had their accounts frozen in Canada.
Oh my, and is it mostly the same few banks or banks across the board?
So in Canada, you have 5 major large banks, and I haven't heard the data, but I expect that most of those banks, if not all of those banks, participated in the freezing of accounts.
That is so terrifying. Will your action, if it's successful, also prevent future freezing of assets as a political weapon or as any kind of unconstitutional overreach? Will it prevent that from happening again?
That's the hope. And there's no precedent for this type of thing, for the rebranding of a constitutional right as some illegal, the exercise of some constitutional right as an illegal activity, and then freezing people's bank accounts who supported it. So yes, there needs to be precedent set, and the hope is that it would prevent this type of abuse.
And could there be damages from the banks as well? Are you suing the banks as well for freezing the accounts?
The Justice Center only deals with constitutional issues, and so the application is against the government. But certainly Canadians who had their accounts frozen and now unfrozen would have recourse against the banks. The government might say, well, there's no recourse if you freeze the accounts, and they might try and pass laws to say that. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of contract, and so that's going to be an issue for the courts to determine.
Right. I just want to share that when I was being interviewed by this global news channel in Canada, the reporter said, "Did you send money to the protesters?" And it just seemed like a super creepy, invasive question. Could foreigners who supported the Canadian truckers have their accounts frozen as well? Have you heard of such a thing? Is this a multinational effort to suppress support for the truckers?
I haven't heard that. The assets, of course, which were with Give Send Go, the money that had been donated, that money is still with Give Send Go, and so, but yes, it is creepy, and you're probably aware that the Canadian government, to a significant extent, funds the media in Canada.
I am aware of that. It was very disturbing. Yeah. As a journalist, I was startled and shocked. I was also asked which of my friends was at the protest by the reporter. Super creepy. Moving along. Well, you've been so generous with your time. Do you feel like there is a groundswell of support from Canadians for, getting their democracy back? Or do you feel that mostly people have been beaten down and are being forced to accept the new normal?
I think that there's growing awareness that civil liberties in Canada are in peril. I think that people have had it so good for so long in Canada and in the Western world. There's no collective recollection of how bad things can get.
Right.
And people have forgotten to a significant extent where these rights came from. They come out of centuries of abuse and ultimately recognition that rights are inalienable and that they don't come from the state.
Beautiful. To my last question, I promise, you've been so generous with your time. Your clients, what led them personally to take the risk and to be out front in bringing this action? And after you answer that, if you tell me what led you personally to devote your talents and your energies and your professional life to defending the rights of Canadians.
Sure. So I'll answer the second question first. The Justice Center has retained Calgary Counsel. Brendan Miller, Blair Ector are both lawyers for some of the applicants who are challenging the Emergencies Act declaration. With respect to the truckers, most of them are simple people. They are hardworking people, and for 2 years they were squashed.
Right.
And like I said, they're desperate. And there are people who, even if they are not desperate because they are not being discriminated against by the Canadian government, yet they commiserate, right? They empathize with the people who are being squashed by these vaccination mandates and lockdown measures and terrible tyrannical overthrowing of civil liberties. And so they joined this protest as an action of solidarity. And it's ultimately people generation to generation who decide if civil liberties are going to be preserved. It's a generational question.
Very, very, very eloquent. So finally, how can people support you if people are listening and they want to help, they want to send you money, they want to send, any kind of support they can to help your clients or put political pressure on the people you're bringing action against? How would they do that most effectively?
Well, the Justice Center is a not-for-profit. It's non-partisan, non-political, and it doesn't take any government funding. So we have cases across the country, and if you want to donate to help the Justice Center's cases, you can do that at www.jccf.ca. Fantastic.
Well, Jay Cameron and your clients, I know that I hope hundreds or thousands of Canadians and people around the world will be watching this with great enthusiasm and being very moved that you step forward with your leadership and with the leadership of the clients that you represent. And I know we're all wishing you every success, and everyone help them, send them all the resources you can to fight this worthy, peaceful fight. Thank you so much, Mr. Cameron, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all you do, Dr. Wolf.
Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf of Daily Clout, and I am asking you to please, if you like the video you just saw, support us, become a member, donate. You can send checks to P.O. Box 24, Millerton, New York, 12546, or go to Daily Clout, DAILYCLOUT, become a member or donate. Thank you so much for your support. Every penny goes for paying our hardworking staff, paying hosting costs, and paying our lawyers who have been leading the fight to keep you safe and free, to keep the Constitution safe and to keep you free. Thank you so much.